Ever since I was a kid, I have loved the Boeing 727. It's one of those things I don't really know why. It just looks awesome. In my opinion, when it comes to jetliners, airliners, this is one of the most striking and beautiful looking airplanes I've ever seen. I just think it looks fantastic. And it started being used commercially in 1964, and they continued to produce them until 1984. And they were used well into the late 90s, early 2000s by many carriers. The 727 was it's a mid-sized, narrow-body, three-engine jet, and in its configurations, it usually could carry between 150 to 190 passengers. But it could fly up to about 2,700 miles nonstop. You know, what's interesting too is that the 727 is the only three-engine jet that Boeing ever made for commercial production. If you look at the 707, which was one of the predecessors to the 727, they shared very similar fuselage designs. It actually almost looks like he just took the fuselage from a 707 and changed the wings and the engine and the tail. The first edition of the 727 was the Dash 100 model, which was shorter. And you can identify the difference between the 100 and the 200 model. The two striking characteristics are obviously the length of the fuselage. But if you look at the number 2 engine head on, the 100 model has more of an oval shape to the engine, and the 200 model had a round cowling on the front. One of the things that was an issue for the 727, though, was that it's actually one of the noisiest commercial airliners. And so that started getting into some regulatory issues with noise abatement and issues around airports and neighborhoods. Particularly in the 90s, noise became an issue. And a lot of airports and neighborhoods were complaining with the outdated engines. And so a lot of the 727s were outfitted with hush kits just to reduce that noise. The 727 had the older turbojet engines as opposed to the newer high bypass turbofan engines. So they produced less power while making more noise. So these hush kits really became a necessity for them. When I was a kid, my dad was an A&P mechanic for American Airlines, and he worked on the 727s. And I remember him describing installing the hush kits on the 727s at the time. And it was a very lengthy process for them to do their entire fleet. Even with the hush kits, though, a lot of airports have banned the 727 because of how loud it really is. Currently, it's estimated that there's around 40 727s still flying in the world today. Typically, the 727 had a 3-seat and 3-seat on either side of the aisle configuration. The 727 had a 3-crew cockpit. You had your pilot on the left, your co-pilot on the right, and then your flight engineer to the right and behind. There was also a jump seat to the left, which back in the day, sometimes people would be able to catch a flight sitting in that jump seat if you were a crew member from another flight, or even just somebody who would work for the airline. I remember my dad used to be able to catch flights sitting in the jump seat in the cockpit just for personal travel. For a long time, there were more 727s built than any other airliner. By the time they quit production in 1984, there had been over 1,300 of them built, which then later that was surpassed by the 737, but at the time that was an astronomical amount. One of the cool things about the 727 too that was particularly unique was that in the rear, underneath the tail, there was a stair system. They called it the air stair. In fact, it was able to be opened in flight. I know a friend of my father's had done skydiving out of a 727, and they jumped out of the back. They opened those air stairs in flight, and they jumped out of the back of it. Later, they changed that design, though, because there was a situation with a hijacker, and he hijacked an airplane, a 727, and then he jumped out, he parachuted out of the back of the airplane in flight. So they later changed the design so that the stairs couldn't be opened during flight. Since the 727 didn't have any wing-mounted engines, they utilized leading-edge devices. They called them Kruger flaps or hinged flaps on the inner wing, and they had extendable leading-edge slats out to the wingtip. And then trailing edge lift enhancements. They had these triple slotted Fowler flaps that could be used on the entire wing. So you see on these, the 727s had these enormous flap wing areas, and this really made it a lot more capable and stable at slow speeds. It had all the way up to a 40-degree flap setting. There was a situation with the flaps, though, that made it so that they disallowed using any more than 30 degrees of flaps. The 727 was one of those airplanes that was extremely capable. It could come in and out of smaller airports as well, relatively speaking. It was used for passengers, and it was also used for freight. And you even see some carriers, people had used them for private service. Just as a side note, doesn't the 727 with winglets look awesome? I wish they all had winglets. I know that was something that near the end of its useful life, many carriers had started debating about whether to do or not, because the winglets obviously helped with fuel efficiency. Very few of them you see with winglets, but I think they just look fantastic. The incident with the flaps was TWA Flight 841, and that happened in 1979. They were cruising at 39,000 feet with the autopilot on when they went into this steep roll to the right and then went into a spiral dive. And they dove 34,000 feet in just over a minute. And thankfully, the pilots were able to gain control of the aircraft, and they made a successful emergency landing. It exceeded the Mach limits for the airplane and received structural damage as a result of that. No fatalities happened, but a number of the passengers and crew members were injured. So when the NTSB investigated, they determined that the cause of it was actually pilot error. One of the interesting characteristics of the 727 was, we talked about the flaps being able to extend all the way to 40 degrees, but the first setting of the flaps was just a 2-degree setting, which is barely discernible. So what would happen is the flaps would extend straight out before they would start to go down. So at that first setting, they would, at 2 degrees, they would extend straight out, and then they would stop there. So what was happening was some crew members, while they were flying, would deploy that, and then they would pull the circuit breaker for the leading edge slat so that they wouldn't deploy. So the flaps would come out, effectively increasing the surface area of the wing while they were in cruise flight. The reason they did this was that it was supposed to increase lift without increasing drag. That allowed them to be able to cruise at a higher speed at a higher elevation with decreased fuel consumption. The thing is that flaps and slats are only designed to be deployed at slow speeds, like during takeoff or landing. So there was many factors involved here. There was some mechanical issues as well as there was some pilot issues. So this led to some restrictions. These are the kind of things that I find really interesting. Just learning these little bits of history. When you see an airplane and you think, okay, that's a cool airplane, but then you learn about the things that went into the production of it and the history of it and the incidents surrounding it. Those are the kind of things that I like to learn about, and that I like to share with others if they're interested in learning as well. If you have experience flying in any of these airplanes, any stories that you'd like to share, put it in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it, and I'd love to share those as well. These are the kind of things that really make this interesting and make you start to see the fascinating history, mechanical capabilities, and just all of those things. When I was a kid, we used to fly on the 727 all the time. It was very common for the American Airlines fleet. My dad was an A&P for American Airlines, and so anytime we would fly somewhere, it seemed it was almost always on the 727 or the MD-80. And at the time, I always thought it was a cool looking airplane, but I didn't appreciate how interesting it was until they started to phase them out of the fleet. And it's an airplane that I miss. You haven't seen them around really since the late 90s now, and I'd love to be able to see one again. It's just a fascinating piece of history, and I've always enjoyed them. I actually spent quite a bit of time looking for my dad. Somewhere still has all of his books for all of the systems for the 727 from when he was actively working on it. He's got stacks and stacks of them in there. Really interesting to look through. I couldn't find any of them. I found the jacket, but maybe if I find them at some point in time, I'll put something up where I see those as well.